So welcome everyone. My name is Bénédicte Santoire and I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Ottawa. I'm also volunteering with Minds Action Canada for a year now, so I'm pleased to moderate today's public webinar called What's Next for the Nuclear Ban in Canada. So just to give you an overview of the event, this webinar is co-organized by Project Plowshares and Minds Action Canada. Both are partner organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, a campaign that, as you probably know already, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. So this webinar is broadly speaking on the future of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Canada. So the panel discussion will bring together Canadian and international experts to discuss the upcoming first meeting of state parties of the treaty in Vienna soon. So at a time when the risk of nuclear war is higher than it has been in decades, we believe that the first meeting of state parties in Vienna is an opportunity for the world to pave the way towards global nuclear disarmament. And of course, we think that it would be crucial for Canada to attend this historic diplomatic meeting as an observer. So before we start, I would just like to remind the audience to use the Q&A function to ask questions to the panelists. So each panelist will do a 7 minutes presentation, no more than that. And after that, we will go straight into the Q&A. So I would like to remind you that the event is recorded. So without further delay, I will introduce our first panelist, Avinash. So Avinash Pal Singh is a first-year university student majoring in biological sciences and is based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He was a co-chair of the International Youth Nuclear Peace Summit in 2019. Believing in the importance of continued youth activism in the disarmament movement, Avinash successfully co-led the campaign to have Winnipeg endorse the ICANN Cities Appeal. So he's a board member of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Canada and is currently working at the office of Senator Marie-Lou McPhedran as a Manitoba Youth Liaison. So over to you, Avinash. I know you have the PowerPoint. You can share your screen and we're happy to hear you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And can you all see my screen?
Yeah,
perfect.
All good.
All right. So before I start off with my presentation, I just want to say quickly how delighted I am and honored to be on such an esteemed panel of guests. And today I want to talk to you about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and also bring in sort of my experience as a youth activist and some of the observations and lessons I think we can take from that, being a youth activist in the disarmament movement in Canada. And, well, what are we looking at here? This right here is a map, and it shows us two places that I want to focus on. The one in blue is Churchill, Manitoba, and the one in red is a geographic location, not inhabited at all, but it's going to be called Broad River. And that's about 120 kilometers southeast of Churchill, Manitoba. And so Churchill, polar bear capital of the world. And today I think the population is roughly equal to the population of polar bears, roughly the same proportion. And that's where it gets its really notoriety from the amount of polar bears we have up there. And it's truly one of the, I guess, magical places in our province. I've never been there myself, but I think we have nothing bad to say about Churchill. It's just such a wonderful place. But here's the thing. There's a unique connection, a Manitoban connection to nuclear weapons programs in the past, and I wanted to share that with you today. And the other location that I was just mentioning earlier is Broad River, and this is the exact same map, but we're zoomed in. So let's zoom in again, and here we are. This is Broad River, Manitoba. And I want to tell you an interesting story here, just to highlight a what-if scenario for nuclear weapons and their impact, the humanitarian impact. And the story goes is that back in the 1950s, this was during the early stages of the Cold War, the British had developed their own nuclear weapons program. and they were just about ready to test it. And of course, once you develop and spend so much money, so much investment, you want to look at places to deploy these weapons, to test and to see sort of at the conclusion of your program to observe what the effect is. And they had to look around the empire at the time, as well as the Commonwealth, to look for specific locations to test their weapons. And something that I did not understand or even realize as an activist until many years into doing this, into doing my own research, is that Broad River, Manitoba was a potential testing site for this nuclear weapon. And this right here is the Blue Danube. This is a replica, of course, of the nuclear weapon that they wanted to test. And Canada was at the top of the list for when they wanted to test this weapon. The weapon itself, it's hard to say because there are scarcely few reports, but from the ones that we can attest to their authenticity, they had a range of about 8 to 40 kilotons. And for our purposes, we'll say it's 25 kilotons, just to visualize what the impact would have been. And that's nearly comparable to the nuclear bomb that was dropped over Nagasaki, and much larger than the nuclear bomb that was dropped over Hiroshima. And the plan was to test up to 12 Blue Danubes from the period of 1953 to 1959. And this right here is a simulation. If you go online and type in nuke map, you'll just click on the first thing that you see, and you can emulate what it could have been like if you had, for example, the same nuclear yield as the bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you compare those kiloton yields and place them on anywhere in the world, you can sort of visualize and see what the effect could have been. So I did exactly that. And I tried to see for myself what the impact could have been, and if we had actually done this testing in Broad River. And what you're seeing in yellow and red is the immediate fireball that comes out of that. So we're assuming 25 kilotons, just roughly the same size as the one that was dropped over Nagasaki. So if you're going to overlay this, this would be the exact same thing you would see of a map of Nagasaki after the impact of that weapon. And you can see that it is tremendous. In green, we have a diameter of about 1.6 kilometers. And that's just enough, really, for a fatal dose of radiation. And even if people weren't living there, as they stated in their report, there was certainly wildlife. We don't get our reputation for being a polar bear capital of the world with no wildlife in the area. And I also want to show you something else. Theoretically, it's not going to be a non-windy day. The wind can come from anywhere. And the thing is, we're not too far off from Churchill, where they were trying to test this weapon. And this is just one possible scenario, assuming that the wind blows this way. And then we have it going westward. And just to give you an impression of how far that thing can go with the fallout, this is exactly it. Of course, they never pursued this program, and it's hard to say what could have happened, but this is as best as we can get with simulating that possible outcome. And thankfully for us Canadians and for us Manitobans and for all those in Churchill, we didn't have to go through this reality. Could you imagine the conversation we'd be having today, or even the notoriety for some place like Churchill? It could have been like the polar bear capital of the world to the radiation capital of Canada. And thankfully, we don't have to deal with that scenario because it never materialized. But unfortunately, it did somewhere else. And we could directly attest to those impacts, the humanitarian impacts in Australia, which was second in the list for a possible nuclear test site for this British nuclear weapons program. And this right here, these two images, oops. To the left is just a close-up of the first nuclear weapons tested. This is in 1952. And to the right is the same, but it's just farther away. And this is roughly 15 kilotons. So to think that a weapon of 25 kilotons, it would have just been devastating. And to attest also to the outcome of this, it's not just that the bomb goes boom. We also have to clean it up. We have to invest money to make sure this place is clean. And for the people locals that live in the area and for the wildlife, we definitely don't want to see those negative health outcomes as we have seen in the past with other nuclear weapons testing. So it is the direct investment economically. In terms of humanitarian impacts, we can see that with the fallout, at least in the simulation, there's so many variables at play, and it's hard to take that risk, especially when you see it in the past close calls and other weapons programs. And that's just my brief overview of what a humanitarian impact could look like as a result of nuclear weapons testing. And like I said, we didn't have to deal with that, but someplace else did. And I think if you look hard enough, you can find a Canadian connection to just about everything. And now turning our focus to education. This is really where I came in. This is my entry point into the movement, which was a lack of education in our curriculums. No curriculums focus on nuclear weapons or disarmament. And if anything, it would be a direct, maybe 2-3 sentences in reference to the nuclear weapons bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's hard to humanize an issue when you only spend a few sentences even acknowledging that it existed. And of course, we can't just blame this on the teachers because they have very little flexibility. And for us students, for us to understand what's going on, a significant leap of knowledge is required. But that's not to say that we're not completely not present in the conversations. We absolutely are. But the problem is we're being educated through the headlines. It's hard to communicate those nuances for someone who's not familiar with the movement through headlines. So I hope you can see this clearly. Let's just move it here. This is fairly recent. This is a couple months ago, as we can see with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. The direct consequence of that being a nuclear weapons country invading a non-nuclear weapons country and seeing these headlines. And Fox News is concerned. Putin's war in Ukraine is raising nuclear concerns and the Dow is going up. And here's the thing. When we communicate these things through headlines, it's hard to humanize the issue, as I said, but it was also hard to get people interested. Who cares if Trump scraps the Iran nuclear deal? Who would care? And for us youth, being exposed to so many doomsday scenarios, such as the ongoing climate change crisis, it's hard to keep focus of all this that's going on at once. And for me, my entry point to this was the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit, acknowledging that, yes, there was a lack of education for us youth in Canada, but having these summits is a total game changer. And here's why. We had about 10 facilitator schools, I was among them, and we had about over 100 students that took part. And it was a 3-day summit. We educated each other on different aspects of nuclear weapons, such as the economic cost, the humanitarian cost, the history. And we drafted and ratified our own Youth Nuclear Peace Treaty. And a lot has come since then, because when you gather this many youth in one place, and for us, it was at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So we wanted to directly convey that this is a human rights issue. And this is something that you should care about. And it's a truly beautiful picture at the top here. We had, like I said, over 100 students, but they came from all over the province and all over the country. And in this 3-day summit, we couldn't fully address all the gaps in our curriculums, but we truly learned a lot. And we took that quite far. So here's some pictures for you. And we also had guest speakers come and talk to us with their different perspectives. And it was really exciting. And post-summit, we of course continued our communications using Slack, using other forms of social media, and sharing our presentations with each other. So right here, I just have a screenshot of one of the conversations we're having post-summit. So having these forums, having these events in person, at least pre-COVID and even during COVID, attending webinars, truly powerful instruments in addressing the educational gap. And for me personally, I partnered with one of my close friends in high school, and we wanted to do this I Can Cities Appeal campaign for our city. And it was launched in 2018, sort of as a way for cities to reaffirm the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because ultimately cities are targets. And over 100 cities had taken the lead before we started our campaign. And today there are about 17 Canadian cities. Essentially, it's a pledge to broadcast support and call on our federal governments to join. And it works, it really works. And I just want to show you a screenshot here of one of the decisions that came out of our city council. Point number 1 and point number 2 is essentially what it is. And yes, it is symbolic, but the amount of work that goes in with communicating with other youth, as well as connecting local organizations, it was memorable. And I think it also highlighted the intersectionality of the issue. You can't look at disarmament without addressing sort of the refugee crisis that could entail from that. And we have many refugee organizations in Winnipeg, and we contacted them soliciting for their support. And in the end, I think when you highlight the intersectionality, but also communicate that to other youth so that they can get interested, just as we did with the summit. It's truly beautiful. It comes together. And a lot of work did go into this, but we have a lot more work still. And I just want to reflect on youth empowerment as an activist, and also as someone who wants to bring other youth activists into the movement. I think we've come a long way with getting youth engaged. As I said, there is still an educational gap, but having these forums is a way to address that. And while it's not perfect, we are truly making progress. And for me personally, looking at disarmament as not just disarming nuclear weapons, but as a whole other way of thinking of doing international relations. It's about framing participation and cooperation away from weapons that can kill us or maim us or traumatize us, but actually taking that and making it a foundation of respect, working towards peace and involving youth in those discussions away from these weapons. If you frame it that way, you're much more likely to get more youth supportive, because ultimately this is our future. We're going to be inheriting a world still full of nuclear weapons. And for us, taking part in the disarmament movement now is a way of taking charge of our future. And while we can't convert our voices to votes, we can take part in the city's appeal campaign. We can attend summits like the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit, and we can attend webinars and learn more about this. And a component of that is also strengthening our intergenerational partnerships. We fight for the same ideals as those during the Cold War. We want to see no nuclear weapons. And whatever path that takes us, it's much of the same. And also much we can learn from those that have already done the protests or have already lobbied their city council to do these things before. So in doing our city's appeal campaign, for example, we reached out to organizations, but we also reached out to people who could advise us from their own experience, say back during the Cold War, based on what they have seen in their movements. Way before we were born, these things were already done, and we could use that and learn from those experiences. In revitalizing the movement, we should learn from the past and see what's already been done. And I would like to just end off by saying, thank you very much for having me. And this right here is a picture of Rose in the middle. She is my colleague that worked on the ICANN Cities Appeal campaign. And to the right, his name is Shavain, also a close friend. He ended off a speech of his in these words, and this is exactly how I want to end off. It is in our hands that we take action to better our own future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Avinash, for your presentation. I enjoyed hearing your perspective as a young scientist, though what you showed us at the beginning is really bone-chilling. We definitely do not recognize enough the huge amount of awareness that young people do in disarmament movements around the world. So thank you for your work. Hopefully we can address that a bit further in the Q&A. But without further delay, I will present the second panelist. Tim Wright. He is a treaty coordinator of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. So Tim helped establish ICANN in 2006 and has served the campaign in various capacities since then. So the floor is yours, Tim. We're excited to hear you.
Thank you very much, Benedict, and hello to everyone. It's my pleasure to participate in this meeting, especially given that it's happening in Australian business hours, which doesn't usually happen for me. I'm usually up late at night for these kinds of things, so that's very fortuitous. I'd like to thank Minds Action Canada and Project Ploughshares, as you said at the beginning, Benedict, both being partner organisations of ICANN. I want to talk in general terms about the treaty on the about the meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and I believe that Erin and Ray will go into more detail about why it is that Canada should be officially represented at this meeting. It comes at a really crucial moment as the world is grappling with this increased risk of nuclear weapon use, and I think that for many people around the world, this is the first time in a long while that they've really turned their minds to that possibility that a nuclear weapon could be used. And indeed, for younger people, perhaps it's the first time that they have. We're faced with a situation where nuclear-armed states are essentially involved in a war against each other. Of course, Ukraine itself is not nuclear-armed, but countries that are supplying Ukraine with conventional weaponry are nuclear-armed states. And so there's an undeniable nuclear dimension to this conflict. Of course, we've heard comments from President Putin of Russia that along the lines that he would be willing to unleash devastation on a scale not seen before. And those kinds of comments can only be interpreted as nuclear threats. And while this is happening, we have also seen Sweden and Finland apply for membership of NATO, which describes itself as a nuclear alliance and which can only contribute to those tensions that already exist. And so it's against this backdrop of increased risk and increased tension that this first meeting of states parties is taking place. This is the first major international conference on nuclear weapons to be held since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think that it would be grossly irresponsible for any country not to participate in such an important meeting. Any country that's concerned about the threat of nuclear weapons, the consequences of their use, should be present at this meeting and making its views known. The meeting is being convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations. All states have been invited to participate, whether or not they're states parties to the TPNW. A country that hasn't yet joined the TPNW can participate as an observer. Observing the meeting of states parties doesn't mean sitting there in silence. An observer can make statements, an observer can do more or less anything that a state party can do other than participate in decisions such as adopting rules of procedure and adopting outcome documents and so on. There are 2 NATO countries that have so far announced that they'll be observing the meeting, Norway and Germany. And in addition, Sweden and Finland, among others, have also indicated that they plan to observe. This does not mean that those countries have made a commitment to join the treaty at some point in the future. They haven't. But what it does mean is that they broadly support or want to be seen as broadly supportive of the principles of the treaty, and that they're willing to engage in a constructive dialogue with TPNW states parties. And I think that for a country like Canada, which historically has been quite vocal in support of nuclear disarmament, this is really the bare minimum of what should be expected by civil society. What exactly is happening in Vienna? It's a whole week of activities beginning on the 18th and 19th with the Nuclear Ban Forum, which is a civil society forum organised by ICANN. This is the first major meeting that ICANN has organised since early 2020 due to the pandemic. So it'll be an important moment for us to come together as a global campaign and work on building our global movement. Immediately after that, on the 20th of June, there will be a conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, which is being hosted by the government of Austria. And on the same day, a meeting of parliamentarians who are supportive of the TPNW. So that conference on the impacts of nuclear weapons is a continuation of the conferences that took place in 2013 and 2014, and which informed the negotiations for the TPNW in 2017. And then on the 21st, from the 21st to the 23rd of June will be the meeting of states parties itself. What will happen at the meeting of states parties? There are a number of practical matters that will need to be dealt with, such as adopting rules of procedure, and then the states parties will discuss all aspects of implementation of the treaty, including declarations, safeguards, verification of the elimination of nuclear weapon programs, national implementation measures, victim assistance and environmental remediation, and how states can work together to universalize the treaty. One of the tasks of this meeting of states parties is to set a deadline for the elimination of nuclear weapon programs. So if a nuclear armed country joins the treaty, it's required to eliminate its program as soon as possible, but within a particular deadline. We expect that that will be set at around 10 years with a possible extension. There will also be a deadline set for the removal of nuclear weapons that are hosted on a state party. So a state can join the treaty with nuclear weapons of another country stationed on its territory, but it will need to get rid of them promptly and within the deadline set by this meeting. And we expect that that deadline will be around 3 months. The meeting of states parties will also adopt, we hope, a final document reflecting the decisions of the meeting and political commitments by the states parties to take forward the treaty's implementation. We expect that it will include calls on other states to take action, and there'll be a big focus on universalizing the treaty. And this, of course, remains a big part of our work at ICANN, is to make sure that more countries come on board. We currently have 61 states parties, the most recent state being the Republic of the Congo, which ratified just yesterday. And we want to see that number steadily increase, because we believe that each new ratification of the treaty strengthens the treaty's norms. So it strengthens the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons. It strengthens the norm of non-possession of nuclear weapons. And each new ratification should also be seen as an important contribution towards international peace and security. And so if we can keep the momentum up globally, especially in light of the increased nuclear risks that we're facing, then that will help to ensure that this treaty achieves its objectives. Finally, I want to mention that ICANN published a major report last year on NATO and the TPNW. It was called A Non-Nuclear Alliance, and that report documented the very broad support for this treaty. And you would know in Canada just how much public support there is, how many non-government organisations are in favour, in fact, how many kind of backbenchers in the parliaments are in favour, or even decision makers who just aren't willing to kind of speak up and take the decisions that they need to take to bring countries on board. And that's the case in so many NATO countries. We see this very broad support, and yet they're just not willing to take that step. So we need to keep up the pressure, keep building the support, and demonstrate that this is just a matter of political will. There are no legal barriers for a NATO state to join the treaty. This is the conclusion of all of the international lawyers who we've consulted. And so there's really no excuse if your country wants to see nuclear weapons eliminated, if it believes that these weapons are a problem, then it needs to take that step of declaring them illegal, joining the global majority in saying that these weapons should never be used and must be totally eliminated. So I look forward to seeing many members of Canadian civil society in Vienna in June, as well as, I believe, a number of parliamentarians, but I really hope that your country and my country, Australia, will be officially represented at that meeting too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim, for your important insights from Australia. You're right. The meeting in Vienna comes at a really crucial moment in world politics. Our third panelist now is Ray. So Ray Atchison is the Director of Disarmament at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They represent the League on the steering committee of the ICAN and a number of other disarmament campaigns. So Ray has written extensively about nuclear disarmament, including the recently published book, Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. So Ray, you can go ahead.
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me to participate. It's not often I get to be on a webinar with Tim anymore because of the time zones, so this is quite fun, and great to be with everybody else, of course, as well. So a lot of what I'm going to say builds off of Tim's remarks, really, especially in terms of NATO and the current context, and to speak more about why Canada should come to the meeting of states parties, and of course, even more fundamentally, join the TPNW. So as many of you on this call probably know, our government has refused to join the treaty so far. Justin Trudeau has even described it as being, quote, sort of useless, unquote, which is quite something to say in Parliament about an international agreement that has been supported by the vast majority of countries in the world, but there we are. Trudeau has also refused to meet with the esteemed Setsuko Thurlow, who I believe is on this call, when ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And Setsuko was announced to be one of the co-speakers at the Peace Prize ceremony. We tried to connect her to have a meeting with Trudeau, but his office refused to meet with her. And this, of course, is all despite the parliamentary pledge that Tim mentioned, the ICAN Cities appeal work, the public opinion polls, which show overwhelming support amongst Canadian citizens and residents for Canada joining the TPNW. So really the government's position is at odds with majority public opinion on this issue. And the core reason that Trudeau has given for his opposition to the treaty, but also for not coming to the meeting of states parties, is because of NATO solidarity, which is the term that's thrown around whenever governments of NATO don't want to do something. And this has become especially acute against the backdrop that Tim described in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. And with more countries that have traditional independent foreign policies wanting to join in this military alliance, within that context, the concept of NATO solidarity becomes even more complex. But I think it's important for us to remember that NATO was not always a nuclear alliance. And some of you might be familiar with Norwegian scholar Skjolv Ugland, who wrote an excellent article a couple of years ago that really dug deep into the history of NATO's discourse and policy on nuclear weapons. And he showed how over time, the United States in particular compelled NATO to include nuclear weapons in its security doctrine, to introduce the concept of nuclear sharing, and to entrench the idea that NATO is and always will be a nuclear alliance. Canada was an early resistor to NATO becoming nuclearized. That's an important part of our history, along with Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Spain. But our government was bullied into accepting US nuclear weapons on Canadian soil and into permitting NATO doctrine to incorporate nuclear weapons. It wasn't something that Canada supported initially. It was something that it went along with after very clearly and repeatedly objecting to it. And of course, Canada did eventually send back the nuclear weapons that the US was hosting on our territory, but nuclear sharing has persisted in 5 European states. When Germany tried to revive this resistance to nuclear doctrine in NATO in 2009. It said it just wanted to have a conversation within the alliance about nuclear weapons. The US accused it of being selfish, and that's when the language around NATO being a nuclear alliance was solidified, when it wasn't actually written into the original Treaty of NATO. So the core problem with NATO's position on the TPNW is that this means that NATO is rejecting the only treaty that categorically outlaws the most destructive weapon on the planet. So this positions NATO as a supporter of nuclear weapon possession and possible use, rather than of nuclear disarmament. And so those two elements of NATO's positioning are in conflict with each other, because it says that it supports nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and yet refuses to allow its members to support the key instrument that outlaws these weapons. This is at odds, in particular, with Canada's stated pursuit of peace, equality, and human security. These are all concepts that pop up in even our most recent foreign policy documents, and that are supposedly embedded in Canadian DNA. But in the Canadian government's stated intentions and understandings, international relations should be based on diplomacy, cooperation, and coordination. But instead, by persisting through the NATO nuclear doctrine, our security is apparently resting on threats of mass destruction and zero-sum game theory. Rejecting the TPNW is also at odds with the Canadian government's alleged pursuit of a feminist foreign policy. Now, that's a much bigger discussion about all of the ways that Canada is at odds with its own intentions of a feminist foreign policy. But specifically, when it comes to the TPNW, we're talking about the first feminist international law on nuclear weapons. Not only does the TPNW promote gender equality in disarmament and recognize the gendered and racialized impacts of nuclear weapons, but it was also democratically negotiated through what is arguably a feminist process. So unlike a lot of UN disarmament processes or arms control processes, where the most heavily militarized countries in the world have the loudest say, including within NATO, but also within the UN, the negotiations of the TPNW actually created space for all countries to participate on an equal footing, where no one had a veto or the ability to shut things down. So signing and ratifying the TPNW is an opportunity for Canada to show that it truly does embrace a feminist foreign policy, and that requires it to stand up to bullies and to patriarchal traditions that accord might the power over right. So Canada needs to attend the first meeting of states parties and contribute to all of the issue areas that Tim outlined that this meeting is going to discuss, and including deadlines for disarmament and the ending of nuclear sharing, but also the implementation of Articles 6 and 7, which deal with international cooperation, environmental remediation, and victim assistance. These are things that Canada should be able to contribute to even before it has joined the treaty. But of course, it also needs to join the TPNW, to sign and ratify it, to renounce nuclear deterrence, to end its role in the NATO nuclear war planning group and refuse to accept nuclear weapons in its security doctrine, and work to change NATO's position on nuclear weapons. And of course, it could also leave NATO. There's many on this call I know that work very passionately for the abolition of NATO. And so Canada's rejection of this military alliance would be, of course, beneficial in many other issue areas, but specifically when it comes to nuclear weapons, changing that core nuclear doctrine is something Canada could contribute now. Other NATO states are interested in changing nuclear policy. As Tim mentioned, several have indicated that they will come to the first meeting of states parties, so Canada cannot use the NATO solidarity excuse. That solidarity has already been challenged in this issue. And what we really need to do is build up a coalition of countries that are willing to stand up to the doctrine and push back on what they've been forced to accept all these years. We need bold moral leadership for this to happen, of course, and Canada has been that voice in other situations, at least certainly in the moral imagination of Canadians. Our governments have in the past been that voice, whether it's been on landmines or working globally for gender equality or other issues of peacekeeping and peace building. And so we have this history and this belief of our role in the world, but it's at odds with our current positions on nuclear weapons. And so this is an opportunity for historic change in a new era that relies not on violence for peace, but on community and justice for peace. And that's really just so much more important than ever in this current context. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Ray. I particularly enjoyed hearing your thoughts on nuclear disarmament and how this is articulated with the so-called feminist foreign policy. And so I think that the connection between nuclear issues and gender frameworks, like the WPS agenda, is not made as often as it should be. So it was a pleasure for me, at least, to have you here today and hear your insights on that. So our last panelist, but not the least, is now Erin. Erin Hunt is the program manager at Mines Action Canada. She contributes to the work of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, the Cluster Munition Coalition, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and Stop Killer Robots. Erin was a member of the civil society negotiating team during the 2017 process to negotiate the TPNW with the Nobel Peace Laureate, ICANN. So, Erin, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you to everyone for being here this evening, and I guess this morning for Tim. Events like this are really important because what they're helping to do is break down the myths about nuclear weapons. And I think Ray did a really great job of sort of laying out some of these myths that we have begun to associate with nuclear weapons. Like these sort of myths are the ones that tell us that nuclear weapons keep us safe, which we heard from Avinash is not really how things are. Or we hear that they're essential for world order, and that without them, our lives are at risk. But the thing is those aren't facts. We've endowed nuclear weapons with abilities they don't have. All nuclear weapons can do is destroy cities and kill civilians by the thousands indiscriminately. And we don't talk like this about any other weapons of mass destruction. Like you never hear us talk about weaponized anthrax keeping us safe, or how important it is to have a stockpile of sarin to keep world order. But we've created these myths about nuclear weapons. And that's really important because if we created the myths, of course, we can destroy them. And I think the way we've been talking today is really important, and a really good next step for Canada is to start really going after these myths in the Canadian political sphere, which Ray outlined quite a bit of some of the misconceptions. And this is important because, once people have bought into a myth, they become like emotionally, and in many cases, financially invested in maintaining it. The possibility that it might not be true is really challenging, both on like a personal level and, like I said, for financial level for some people. So the global estimate for annual expenditure on nuclear weapons is about $105 billion US, which is about $12 million for the hour that you're going to be joined with us today. And that's a huge investment based on myths with little evidence of actual payoff in terms of security. So, I mean, if a lot of what people talk about with nuclear weapons are myths, what do we know? And I think it's been clear from the work that brought us to this point through the Humanitarian initiative process, through the TPNW negotiations, and through what you've heard from the other speakers is that we know nuclear weapons threaten us all. There's been a lot of near misses since 1945. Pretty much we've gotten this far as a species out of luck, not because of smart strategy. And the risk of accidental nuclear detonation has not reduced. And the news over the past months has really shown that the risk of more intentional nuclear war is higher than ever. So we know that there's no possible humanitarian response if nuclear weapons are ever used again. And we know that the only way to eliminate a weapon is by prohibiting it first. Canada is a pioneer in this. We're the ones who created the humanitarian disarmament approach. It's how we ban landmines. It's how cluster munitions are banned. And it's how we got to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, we know the TPNW is not magic. It's not going to instantly rid the world of nuclear weapons, but it's the best tool we have at the moment to make progress towards nuclear disarmament and on a global scale to challenge these myths we have about nuclear weapons. So, I mean, we've talked quite a bit about what the Canadian government should be doing, but as individual Canadians, what can be our next steps towards dismantling these myths and moving our country closer to the TPNW and nuclear disarmament? Some of these have been raised already, which is really great, and you've heard from sort of some leaders on this issue. We've heard a lot about the city appeal, and as Avinash said, it's a great way to get local attention on the issue. Not only does it demonstrate to the federal government that Canadians care, it can also be a springboard to discussions about investment in nuclear weapons producers. But I'll come back to that in a second. And it often gets media attention at a level that doesn't often follow international development. And that can further encourage other people to support nuclear disarmament. Like to flag Charlotte's comments in the chat that if you do live in Ottawa, the vote for the city appeal is coming up in just a few days. And Ban the Bomb Ottawa has put a letter writing tool out there. And I'm sure Charlotte is currently putting this in the chat while I talk again, so you can find it easily. So that's a very easy way to take action. If you're not based in Ottawa or Winnipeg, you can visit icanw.org/Canada to find out if your municipality has joined the city's appeal by clicking on local support. And if your city is not on that list, you know what to do. Encouraging parliamentarians to join the parliamentary pledge that Tim mentioned and that Avinash mentioned is really important. Parliamentarians are able to directly influence government policy. So that the ican.org/Canada site also has the list of parliamentarians that have joined the pledge. So you can check for your federal MP, the senators for your province, as well as provincial members of legislative assemblies or provincial parliaments. And if they aren't on that list, you can invite them to join. It might take them a while to convince them, especially at the provincial level, that this is an issue that matters to them. So come with information. I mean, you saw an excellent presentation today on what a nuclear weapon could do to Churchill. But you can use the same tool to see what would happen in your own city. So come with information, start a friendly conversation, and just continue to share this information until you can win them over. You can play a long game with this. And next week, Minds Action Canada and Plowshares are hosting a webinar specifically for parliamentarians. So if you see your MP at a Victoria Day parade this weekend, you can ask them to attend. I mean, elected officials are always out for holiday parades, so this is a perfect weekend to find them. Your finances, as I mentioned, are an excellent way to take action as well. So like I said, over $1 billion a year industry for nuclear weapons. So that means a big industry like that means we can also hit them in their wallets in a big way. There's an excellent report called Don't Bank on the Bomb that's told us that some Canadian financial institutions, including all 5 of Canada's big 5 banks, BMO, CIBC, RBC, Scotiabank, and TD, have financial connections to companies that produce nuclear weapons. If that's concerning to you and you bank with one of those banks, you can reach out to them and ask them to stop banking on the bomb, and you can use this resource that's available on the best URL ever, don'tbankonthebomb.com, to get all the details you need for that. And like for cities, they can do the same thing. And if your city has joined the city appeal, you can ask them to make sure that municipal funds are not invested in nuclear weapons producers, and that includes pension funds. You've heard about what Canada should be doing quite a bit, and I'd really like to just reiterate that Canada should be supporting victim assistance and environmental remediation in the TPNW. And Tim mentioned the Civil Society Forum, and you will have the opportunity to participate virtually in that if you can't get to Vienna. So hopefully there'll be a lot of ways that you can take action, and we can continue to challenge these myths that nuclear weapons are essential to our security. Really, the past few months have shown that instead of guaranteeing security, nuclear weapons have acted as a shield, allowing a nuclear armed state to commit war crimes. So now more than ever, it's the time to really challenge these myths and take steps towards the TPNW. So hopefully we'll see some progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin, for your presentation. You're right that we need to change the narrative, the language around nuclear weapons, and most importantly, stigmatizing them, like we did with landmines and cluster munitions. So the presentation are done, so we can go over the Q&A. I have questions, and also we have questions from the audience. So personally, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone how nuclear disarmament intersects with climate justice. But as I said earlier, the link between nuclear issues and gender equality is not always so obvious for everyone. So if possible, I would like to push the panelists on that matter. For example, how our feminist and LGBTQ+ activist movements around the world are involved in nuclear disarmament. So if we have time, considering that we also have questions from the audience, I would be happy to hear you more on that. And so I will ask 3 questions that we have so far. We have one from Terry, who is probably more directed toward Avinash. So it's about Manitoba being a nuclear-free province. So specifically, is nuclear waste, can it be transported across the province? Is that true? We have a question from Tamara about the official position about Canada attending the Vienna meeting. And a third question for now would be from Paul. So several Canadian NGOs have called for a parliamentary committee hearing on the TPNW and the official government position. So why do you think this has not happened, and what strategies should be pursued with parliamentarians to encourage more activism in nuclear disarmament issues? So those are 4 questions so far. I suggest that we do a first round of questions, and then if we have time, a last round of questions with the remaining questions. So if that's okay, Avinash, I would let you speak first.
Thank you for that question, Terry. And no, unfortunately not. Manitoba as a province as a whole is not a nuclear free province. It's, I think that source might have just said that there are certain communities in the country that are nuclear weapons free. There is, I believe, a community in Nova Scotia, might just be Halifax, and Toronto, in fact. During the Cold War, there were movements, grassroots movements, that made those cities nuclear weapons-free zones. So using the ICANN Cities Appeal was one way, at least, to get Winnipeg on board, knowing that there were similar movements, at least in our city as well, during that time. That's helped us immensely, but as a province as a whole, unfortunately not. There's no legislation on that. And in terms of nuclear waste, can it be transported across the province? It's hard to say for sure. I don't know the exact facts on that, but I do know that there are consultations at this moment on the small modular nuclear reactors industry on potential sites in Manitoba. So that could be a scenario that plays out in the next few years. We'll just have to wait and see. As for now, I'm not aware of any sort of legislation that specifically states nuclear weapons, nuclear waste cannot be transported to the province.
Thanks for your answer, Avinash. So maybe Tim, and then Ray, and then Erin, you can pick whatever question you want to answer.
I might just quickly comment on the question about parliamentary engagement, although it's not kind of a direct response to that question, but I wanted to point out that we've got a list on our website of all of the Canadian parliamentarians who have signed the ICANN pledge. It includes members of the House of Commons and Senate, as well as many of the provincial legislative assemblies. Basically, for the House of Commons, almost all of the NDP MPs have signed, as have many of the Bloc Québécois MPs, but there are quite a few Liberals on there as well, and I think that there are many Liberals who are eager to take this forward, but unfortunately the decision making appears to be happening at Global Affairs Canada, where the Foreign Minister is provided with a briefing, and the officials are providing quite kind of cautious recommendations in this area based on what they're hearing from NATO. So I think greater engagement with the Liberal MPs who are really interested in moving this forward, and kind of an expansion of that decision-making process, so it's not just up to the Foreign Minister to decide based on recommendations from the officials. I think it needs to be a democratized process with public input and proper parliamentary debate, rather than just the officials. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of NATO countries, where the officials get their instructions from NATO headquarters, and NATO headquarters gets its instructions from the United States, and that's the decision-making process. But that's not how it should be. And the reason that Germany and Norway have committed to attend the MSP is that decision-making didn't happen within the foreign ministries. It happened as part of political processes leading up to elections, where campaigners were heavily involved in influencing political declarations and so on. So I hope that we can see a broadening of the decision-making across NATO states. Thanks.
So I'll jump in here to answer Tamara's question. So they haven't announced anything officially yet, but what we have been hearing, and the latest update I have is from a week ago, is that it's unlikely that the government will send an official delegation to one MSP. They are likely to send a delegation, probably someone from Capital and someone from Geneva, to the Humanitarian Impact Conference the day before the MSP. But the update we got wasn't sure whether it would ever be announced officially that Canada was not going to come to the MSP. So I don't know if Aaron has more recent information, but that's what I have as of a week ago. So they're still keeping their cards close to their chest, but as far as we know, they're not going to come to MSP, just the Humanitarian Impact meeting.
Yeah, that's the same thing that I've heard. However, that does open up some excellent advocacy opportunities for us as Canadians who want Canada in the room at one MSP, that we need to be reminding the government that the conversations that are going to be starting at the Humanitarian Initiative, Humanitarian Impacts Conference, are going to continue through the MSP. So by only attending the first day, they're going to miss out on part of that conversation. So Canada should really just stay in the room for the next 3 days. And just to really briefly answer Paul's question about parliamentary committees, I honestly think it's more than 50% issue of there being too many things happening on the international agenda and too many crises at the moment, between the ongoing pandemic, the situation in Afghanistan, which is now its own separate parliamentary committee, and then the conflict in Ukraine has, and then related food security issues and all of that. I think that is a pretty big reason that it's not happening. Although I'm sure the government is thrilled that they have that excuse to not hold these committees, that sort of hearing. So I think Tim's right. Reaching out to parliamentarians on a one-to-one basis to get more activism is the way to go.
Thank you, Erin. Is anyone from the audience eager to ask a question? I think Florence had their hand raised. Would you like to step in, or? Okay, so if there are no more questions, it's 8:02. Okay, go ahead, Florence. We still have time. You can unmute yourself and ask a question directly. There is also Erica Simpson as well. Erica, would you like to step in?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry if I can't, I'm just having a little bit of trouble with technology. You can see me sailing there in the Strait of Georgia, right over in Nanaimo, where the United States has its torpedo range nuclear weapons. And that's where they test them. And I was wondering what we can do to denuclearize and make not just Vancouver a nuclear weapon-free zone, but also Canada. So there I am, right over the nuclear weapons. I wanted to give you guys a shot of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. We can take Florence's question. Please go ahead. Florence, if you cannot ask your question, maybe you can use the chat, but meanwhile, I will ask the panelists who are willing to step up and answer Erica's question. Thank you.
I guess since I'm out here on Coast Salish territory as well, I should probably take this one. So yes, I think a lot of Canadians don't realize how close American nuclear weapons are to Canada's west coast. The beach that is a block and a half from where I'm sitting right now often does have nuclear submarines, nuclear armed submarines going past it from the bases down in the Puget Sound. One of the things that we worked on around the entry into force, and something that I hope we can pick up moving forward, is collaboration across the border with American activists who are working on the disarmament of the nuclear armed submarines based in Puget Sound, and began to bring together activists on all sides of the Salish Sea and be pushing towards a Salish Sea nuclear weapons free zone as well. When it comes to all of Canada, I think that possibly the way to check so many things off our to-do list all at once would be for Canada to join the TPNW. That would force a national nuclear weapons free zone. But in terms of the water in particular out here, I'm hoping we're going to be able to continue to build on our collaboration with our neighbors to the south.
Thank you, Erin. Would any other panelist would like to answer this question? No, then it's 8:05, so the webinar has come to an end, and I would like to warmly thank ICANN for funding this webinar and of course, our wonderful speakers and our audience for such a stimulating question. So I thank you all, and thank you for attending and participating in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful
Thanks, everyone.